Hello again. Welcome back to Lecture 4 of our series on Prajnaparamita. Last time we had reached a stage of discussion of where it was said to have been taught, who was there, and then the great surprise that the Buddha introduces us to Subhuti. And so let's go and pick back up that theme as we continue to read the sutra itself. So as we said last time, the Buddha looked out over the 1,250, and in this Tibetan Tanka, the Buddha is in the upper right-hand corner. There are two images of Subhuti on the two left ones. I like this one because it shows some wilderness, so does it imply that Subhuti was the foremost of those who were in the wilderness? But it also shows so much activity that Subhuti is just part of the world. In any case, as we said last time, thereupon the Buddha said to Subhuti, "You who rejoice in teaching, you who like to teach, now you teach bodhisattvas, and you teach them the perfection of wisdom, the prajnaparamita, that they should accomplish." Then we had the surprise from Shariputra. Shariputra was so famous. Look at Nalanda. Nalanda, the big stupa at Nalanda is Shariputra's. His remains, his relics were placed inside this enormous stupa structure that was built where the first Buddhist monastic college was founded. Nobody in the Buddhist circle was more famous in a way than Shariputra, and he remained so. So you can understand in this text, Shariputra, who's later going to have his remains placed under this huge monument and to be revered throughout the ages. Shariputra is puzzled. And he does ask this question that we discussed last time. Will Subhuti teach through his own power? Or is he going to be dependent on the Buddha's spiritual power? It's not him that's teaching, it's the Buddha's somehow. He's speaking through him. He's just the recipient. But nonetheless, the Buddha has called on Subhuti to do it, and not the famous Shariputra. Now, in the Buddhist world, in the Lotus Sutra, which I think came after this text that we're reading today, Shariputra is brought back into popularity. And in the Lotus Sutra, he's the number one. It's only in these Prajnaparamita texts that we find Subhuti being given this high status. Here's the Buddha. The two I'm just using an image here that I like, but of course it's bodhisattvas that are shown, not arhats, and both Subhuti and Shariputra were arhats. But there they were, competing in a sense on both sides of the Buddha. Subhuti was so skillful, not only in teaching, but he was a very highly developed meditator. And he knew what Shariputra was thinking. And so his first words after the Buddha asked him to teach the Prajnaparamita was, in a sense, to address the doubts of Shariputra, who isn't quite up to his level. And these next sentences, I tell you that they are crucial, I think, to understanding some of what happened in the Buddhist tradition for Mahayana to have developed and to become a regular part of the Buddhist tradition. Subhuti says, I'm going to tell you about the teaching. I'm going to tell you who can teach. I'm going to tell you what they can teach. And it may not be what Shariputra expected. Subhuti says, whatever a disciple of the Buddha may venture to teach, of course, that is all based on the powerful work of the Buddha. Subhuti is not discounting the central and key role of Shakyamuni Buddha. Everything is still dependent upon him. However, the disciples of the Buddha, that would be him in this case, Subhuti, is going to teach based on what they have been given in their training and work with the Buddha. So the question is, as we go through the text, we're going to find these words often said. What's the reason? Why is that? And people just ignore this question that often appears. But I think we should pay very close attention to this. This expression, I think, is a marker for divisions within the sutra. And whenever you find it, you should highlight it and understand that it's really important. Subhuti continues, though. He says, those who train in that teaching, that Dharma, that's taught by the Buddha, those who train in that are able to realize, and the text says, the characteristics of the Dharma. They're able to recognize the nature of the teaching. They are able to fully comprehend the teaching. And once they comprehend that teaching, then this is what Subhuti is trying to say in terms of who is it who should teach and what should they teach. And then I think these next words are really crucial to how Buddhism developed. The disciples of the Buddha, those who understand and fully recognize the characteristics, the nature of his teaching, when they fully realize this, whatever they, that is, whatever they proclaim and teach does not contradict the characteristics of this Dharma. That is, when they have been fully trained in the teaching of the Buddha, they're not going to say something which contradicts it. They're not going to say something which is in opposition to it. They understand exactly what the teaching is. And so, because of this, it's because they have been taught, or the Dharma has been taught, dependent on this nature of the teaching. They have, those who have been listening to the Buddha for a long time, when they teach, because they know the nature of the teaching, then whatever they proclaim has been taught dependent on not it doesn't say the power of the Buddha, but it says finally the power of the characteristics or the nature of the teaching. When you consider those words, it opens the door to say the Dharma, the teaching, can be from an enlightened person at any time and any place. Because those who are really trained in the Dharma, they know it. They're not going to say something which is opposed to it. And if you happen to be lucky enough to hear one of these enlightened people who are teaching it, then you know that because they understand the nature of the teaching, that gives them the power to say words which are fully in accord with the teaching. So Subhuti, in one sense, says, Shariputra, if you really understand it, and anybody who fully understands what this teaching is all about, you can teach it too. In other words, the door is open for an expansion of the Buddhist teaching from just the remembered words of Shakyamuni to now the heard words of any enlightened person who fully comprehends the characteristics of the teaching and uses that knowledge to teach themselves, or to teach others, that is. And I think that that's really been the case for Buddhism. And that the expansion of the doctrine, the spread of Buddhism, the number of teachers who have taught, who have been recognized as teaching the Dharma. It doesn't say it here, but in another place it says, whatever is well said. That means whatever you say that's in accord with the way things really are, that's the Dharma. It can be taught. it can still be taught. So this, in a sense, goes against the other idea that you find in part of Buddhism, which is that after the time of the Buddha, the Dharma decreases. And there comes a time when nobody understands it. It's too long after the time of the Buddha. Who remembers what he said in a way which is correct? But in the Prajnaparamita, it says, no, don't say that. In one way, there will always be people who understand it, who can teach it. So try to, if you're lucky enough, find one of these teachers. Find a good teacher. And what you will hear from them will be the Dharma. And I think that's one of the powers that has kept Buddhism alive. It has not become a static tradition in the way that some traditions become, where you must go back to the exact words of the founder. You cannot have any words from these enlightened people who have studied it. So I think these words tell us and open the door to the production of Mahayana literature, that enlightened people can speak the Dharma. And if they can speak the Dharma, then let's hear from as many enlightened people as we can. Let's hear how they interpret the Dharma in their own age, their own time, their own place. These could be taken as some of the most powerful words in the Buddhist tradition. Then Subhuti does something to indicate his understanding of the characteristics of the Dharma. He, in a sense, stands up, and it's not a challenge to the Buddha, I wouldn't say that, but in a sense, he's saying, you told me to teach. You told me to teach bodhisattvas. You told me to teach the perfection of wisdom. But now he addresses the Buddha to show how well he understands the characteristics of the teaching. He says, O world-honored one, the Buddha, you, instead of using a pronoun, the most correct and polite expression is to call one by their title. The Buddha, that is you, has directed me to teach bodhisattvas. What should I teach them? The perfection of wisdom. Because this is what they should be able to achieve and accomplish. Fine. He's repeated the command from the Buddha. He's simply repeating it. But then comes his challenge to everybody in a sense. Because he has a puzzle almost, although I don't think it's intended to be a puzzle. I think it's intended to show that he understands fully the characteristics of the teaching and he says, "O world-honored one." And you'll see that again, the text is punctuated with, "O world-honored one." It tells you who's speaking to whom. He's speaking to the Buddha. "O world-honored one," with respect to that bodhisattva, that is that thing which has been identified with the word bodhisattva, what in the world is the true nature of this word, this bodhisattva? I don't see anything which is known as having the essence, the perpetuity, the unchanging nature of a bodhisattva. I don't see it. I'm sorry, Buddha, you asked me to teach. It's not a challenge. He just says, in a sense, I know what the characteristics of this teaching are. And it is that whatever you say is a real thing, has an essence, is permanent. It's not. So he says, you've asked me to teach a bodhisattva. I don't see anything which is an unchanging bodhisattva. He continues, O world-honored one, I look around, I don't see a bodhisattva. Neither do I comprehend, do I have in mind perfection of wisdom. So, what bodhisattva should I teach perfection of wisdom? He's not accepting the idea, I, as a person, as a real thing, am going to teach, do a specific real act toward an object, which is the audience of bodhisattvas. Because from the perspective of the nature of human experience, all of these, everything is empty of this kind of permanence. So he's now proving that he's really worthy to teach. Because he says, you say teach. I don't see anybody to teach. I don't even know anything which I should teach. And then he goes on to say, if a bodhisattva hears this statement, hears me say this, and they're not startled, they're not afraid, they're not dismayed, they do not turn away, but they continue to practice in accord with what has been taught. That's what's known as teaching a bodhisattva, quote unquote, the, quote, Prajnaparamita, unquote. In other words, the bodhisattva, it's the real enlightened bodhisattva. And of course, bodhisattvas had levels of understanding. We're often hear about the 10 levels of a bodhisattva. But if a bodhisattva hears all this, hears Subhuti say, I don't see any bodhisattvas, I don't know anything to teach. What should I do? What is it that I'm going to do? Subhuti is saying, a bodhisattva who hears that and doesn't become confused and say, wait, what's going on here? What does it mean? There's nothing to teach. There's nobody to teach. There's nobody to do the teaching. What's happening here? And if they become worried and fretful, it means that the bodhisattva doesn't know the characteristics of the teaching. And so, but if the bodhisattva fully accepts what's being said, doesn't startle, doesn't look afraid, doesn't say, I can't listen to any more of this, it's too upsetting. If they, with calm acceptance, say, okay, yes, of course, there is no permanent, unchanging bodhisattva that I, as an unchanging entity, will teach a specific doctrine, then you should know that in that moment, the perfection of wisdom has been taught to somebody who gets it. So that this is one of the great dividing points in the sutra. Every time the sutra says, if when this is taught, the bodhisattva who hears it is not afraid, is not upset, fully accepts it, can deal with it, then we can know that this is teaching the Dharma, the characteristics of the Dharma, the characteristics of the teaching, that there is no permanence. There's no essentialness in things. And once that's accepted, says Subhuti, then for the first time you really have the teaching of the perfection of wisdom. You have what wisdom is all about. See, Shariputra didn't quite get it. In this text, the famous Shariputra thinks to himself, whoa, Subhuti's going to teach, but what is he going to teach? On what basis does he have the authority to teach? He's still expressing an idea that there is a teacher, there is a content, and there's a pupil. And Subhuti is now saying to him and to all the others, you will never, ever teach the perfection of wisdom until you have a situation where you have taught that there is no such thing as a bodhisattva in essence, in unchanging reality. There is no dharma that's unchanging, that is essentially the way it is. Everything changes. Everything changes. Remember that, says Subhuti here. So when I look out to teach, I have to say, what unchanging thing can I teach? I don't see anything that's not changing all the time. And when I teach, what is the essence of what I teach? If what I teach is that I, an essential being, am teaching to an essential being, that's not the perfection of wisdom. You're not, he says, you're not teaching the perfection of wisdom. So in these words in the sutra, we can see the groundwork is laid for what Mahayana can become. That it is something which, if one understands the nature of the teaching, really comprehends it, and doesn't think of being a teacher to a pupil, recognizes the so-called emptiness of our constructs, and still teaches. That teaching, which is done without any idea of the audience, without any idea of how much I know, without any idea of, look at me, what a great teacher I am. If you can have that, then Subhuti is saying to the Bodhisattvas, but particularly he's saying to Shariputra, if you have that, then you're witnessing the teaching to bodhisattvas about the perfection of wisdom that they should accomplish. So thank you very much. In our next lecture, we will once again return to the sutra itself. I recommend to you, please continue to read the translation that's available to you. I'm going to spend a few of these lectures just dealing with the text itself so that we can study its history, we can study its redactions, we can study the way it's done. But I think that there is nothing that is as essential as sitting down and just reading and rereading. I've reread this sutra, I don't know how many times. I first started reading it in 1962, so long ago, and I still need to read it 100 more times. Maybe someday I might actually get it. I'm sorry that I'm teaching it to you, but I got to tell you, I am not fully aware of all that it means and all that it can mean. So your papers and your research, very welcome by me. I look forward to having it. Thank you very much.